You're listening to ARC. Remember this sound? How the story began with an explosion. With the discovery of gold and the expansion of mining activity that would change history and eventually reveal our little relative, the Taung Child. Well, even the beginning isn't as simple as that. I'm gonna rewind about 900 years. The sounds of metalworking were ringing across the Highveld in what is today Limpopo in South Africa. Iron workers were melting and shaping ore into tools and weapons, and artisans were creating jewelry and artifacts from gold. Like a wooden rhino covered in thin sheets of gold, a piece of art so small that it fits into the palm of a hand, the work of a master craftsman. This was Mapungubwe, by all accounts a sophisticated society in its time. Aside from the skilled artisans, they had trade networks that extended across Africa and the Indian Ocean to Asia. This shows that neither mining, gold, or advanced society was introduced to this part of Africa by Europeans. And they, the Europeans, became aware of Mapungubwe in the 1930s. And you'd think this discovery would be a triumph for Raymond Dart. Further evidence that Africa was not this primitive backwater, that this might actually be the birthplace of humanity, like he had argued. Well, it was not a triumph for Raymond Dart. And he didn't see Mapungubwe as a rebuttal to European prejudice. Because while Raymond Dart had argued humans evolved first in Africa, he didn't believe that Africans were capable of developing advanced societies by themselves, in spite of the evidence right on his own doorstep. Here's historian of science, Krista Kuljan.
He attributed all social and cultural progress in Africa to external influences from elsewhere in the world. And this was Dart's view of important sites, such as Mapungubwe.
This is one of the contradictions of Raymond Dart. The man who stood up to the European scientists, on the one hand, couldn't see what was right in front of him on the other. And it wasn't just him. The entire field of human evolutionary research has some very dark roots that must be examined next to the triumphant discovery of the Taung Child and the revolutionary discoveries in South Africa at the time. Dark roots that some prefer not to mention, while others, like paleoanthropologist Lawrence Schroeder, believes need to be examined in all their uncomfortable detail.
So I think about it all the time, about the sort of really dark history of the field. We are scientists, but the stories that get built from the evidence that we collect are informed by, our current context. But I think grappling with this history and not just ignoring it is the way to move forward.
This is episode 3 of the Unburied podcast, season 2. We call it The Dark Side of Dart. My name is Rasmus Spitz. Almost 15 years after Raymond Dart wrote his paper about the incredible new human relative in Taung, he was still working at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He was not yet the legend he was going to become. The Taung Child was still overshadowed by the fake Piltdown man. The scientific establishment had not yet really accepted Africa as the cradle of humankind. All that was still to come, when a telegram arrived in Johannesburg. Here's Krista Kuljan.
On the 9th of September, 1939, Dart received a telegram, and it read, Kanako's eldest daughter, perfect specimen, bushwoman, dying, Oudtshoorn Hospital. If interested, communicate Dr. Nell, local.
Since the disappointment of the Taung Child, Raymond Dart hadn't stopped working on human evolution. But the work he was currently doing had nothing to do with ancient fossils. What he was studying was human beings that were recently deceased, or in some cases, still alive.
And 2 days later, Dart sent Nell a telegram, and his telegram read, Bushwoman, please send information for government authorities concerning name, nature of illness, expectation of life, and possibility of being claimed by relatives. Dr. Nell responded the next day, and the information that he gave Dart was that the young woman's name was Kiri-Kiri. She was suffering from septic pneumonia, and her prognosis was uncertain.
Kiri-Kiri, a 20-year-old woman, a bushman, as they called her. And if you've listened to the first season of the Unburied podcast, you'll know that what to call San or bushman people is a complicated matter. We normally try to call people what they want to be called, but we've no idea about Kiri-Kiri. I think it's fair to assume that nobody asked her. And certainly not when she was lying on a deathbed, far from her family, struggling to breathe, and completely unaware of Raymond Dart's response.
I wish to thank you for your wire concerning the bushwoman Kiri-Kiri and her complaint, wrote Dart. He informed Nell that he had secured approval from the acting secretary for education, Mr. Van Sale, for the University of the Witwatersrand, quote, to obtain from Oudtshoorn the body of a female bushman when it becomes available.
When now, it becomes available, I mean, that's, yeah.
Yeah, it's just devastating, really.
Becoming available. This was how Dart described Kiri-Kiri's imminent death. He had secured the permission to get her body from the government, but he still had one concern.
The only point about which we are uncertain here, wrote Dart, is whether or not there is any likelihood of the body being claimed by a relative. We have presumed that this was unlikely, but calculations in that respect can be easily upset.
So what did Dart base his evaluation on? His concern that the family might want to claim her body. Well, he knew them.
Raymond Dart met Kiri-Kiri and her family in 1936, on that Wits expedition of scientists to the Kalahari.
Southern Kalahari was particularly dry in 1936, and the San living in the desert was struggling. But they couldn't move away as they might have done in the past. over the past several hundred years, a genocide in slow motion, as historian Muhammad Adhikari has called it, left them decimated in numbers and with only a fraction of their land, the driest, harshest part. And it was to this corner of the Kalahari Raymond Dart led an expedition in the middle of the drought.
When I became a guide, I started learning about that expedition. I know that people will use as specimens for cast on people's faces and photograph.
This is Nashada Ndango, guide at the San Heritage Center, Kwatu, north of Cape Town. She's San, like Kiri-Kiri was, but Nashada is Kwedam speaking from Platfontein, not from the southern Kalahari. For this story, Nashada speaks neither on behalf of the San as a whole or her workplace. She speaks for herself. And she knows about the expedition in 1936 from her own studies and oral histories related to her by others.
So most of the time, I've heard these stories of elderly people telling their experience. And based on what I've heard from them, sometimes it gives me a mixed feeling. Sometimes I'm sad and angry.
Nashada's feelings are mixed and complicated. She studies at night and on the weekends because she wants to become an archaeologist, to learn about the past and preserve the history of her people. But the excitement she feels about archaeology is mixed with anger and sadness because of the deeply problematic research done by scientists studying her people in the past. Like Raymond Dart and his team, who came to the Kalahari and set up camp near one of the few remaining water sources. Here they offered small rations of food and access to water in exchange for using people as research objects.
I don't think people did have a choice because that you want to live. You have to do what they're asking you to do. There was no choice to make rather I want to be part of this or I don't want to be part of this. If you see the gun, then you're basically going to be part of it.
We don't know whether anyone was directly threatened by Dart and his team. It's unlikely because it was unnecessary. The power balance was so skewed in favor of the white scientists that nobody needed to point a weapon at the people struggling to get enough food and water to make them participate in the research.
He had the power to make it happen, which sometimes break my heart when power relationship comes in, where somebody have power and then the others are inferior. They don't have the power to do anything.
Dart and his colleagues measured people. They made them undress and took pictures and made casts of their bodies.
Even though when you feel that it is not right, at the same time, you can't do anything at all because you don't have power. Power played an important role when scientists involved San people in their research. And I think this power that I had ruined a lot of people's life.
Amongst a group of 77 people Dart had gathered in the Kalahari was an old man named Maurice. He is said to have been close to 100 years old. He is Krista Kuljan.
And they issued each of them with a cardboard tag and a number. So Maurice was tagged as KAL or Kalahari 4. His daughter Kanako was KAL 5. And his granddaughter, Kiri-Kiri, was KAL 51.
With 77 people labeled with cardboard tags, Dart and the others took out the equipment. Calipers, notepads, cameras, and measuring tapes. They measured people's faces, their skulls, recorded eye color, the texture of their hair, and wrote it all down on the tags. I imagine for the scientists, there was nothing unusual about this. It was field work. They might as well have been studying plants or rocks. Here's Nashara Ndango again.
They were so confident that they were right. I think it's because that when they see sand people, they will see them as nothings and nobodies. And then people will like measured or classified or like compared closer to animals.
Closer to animals. And closer to our ancestors.
Maybe this group of people is the breeds like between modern day humans and the early humans. So let's just go take them and then do research on them to see if it is what we are thinking. So like at that time, I don't think they did really had evidence of showing that these are like people who are closer to the early humans. I think they just wanted to do it because they met these people that looked different.
The scientists did see the sand as some kind of living fossils, which is not only offensive but also scientifically completely wrong. The sand were and are just as evolved as the scientists studying them. And when you think about it, it's ironic. Because if Raymond Dart really wanted to understand the racial hierarchies of the world, why he was in a position of power and had all the resources and the sand did not, studying them was kind of pointless. He should have studied himself and the history of European colonial expansion. But there was no self-reflection of this kind in the findings Raymond Dart published the following year. Here's Krista Cooljan.
So Dart's 1937 publication in the Wits journal Bantu Studies makes quite disturbing reading because he gave special attention to the measurements of female genitalia, male genitalia. He believed that taking measurements and photographs of intimate body parts would contribute to the effort to confirm these racial types.
Raymond Dart was disturbingly familiar with the people he'd studied for the past 3 years when Dr. Nell contacted him with the news of Kiri-Kiri's critical condition. He would have known exactly who to contact if he wanted her family to know.
Now, there's no documentation indicating whether Dart or Dr. Nell or anyone else informed Kiri-Kiri's mother, Kanako, or any of her other relatives, with whom Dart had previously been in communication about the fact that she was ill.
If Dart contacted the family when Kiri-Kiri was fighting for her life in hospital, there's no documentation of this in the archives. But what we do know is that he told his technician, Eric Williams, who had accompanied him to the Kalahari, to pack up and get ready for another trip. He told Williams to go to Oudtshoorn, more than 1,000 kilometers away. And then he waited for the telegram that arrived 2 days later.
And the message said, "Bushwoman died last night."
On September the 1st, 1939, the Nazi army smashed into Poland.
In late September 1939, German forces under Nazi leadership had invaded Poland, setting off the events that soon would be known as the Second World War.
Adolf Hitler's all-out attack on Poland makes the long-dreaded European war a certainty.
I don't know whether Eric Williams listened to the reports of the Nazis advancing when he drove the long way back to Johannesburg, or indeed if there was a radio in his trunk.
At this time, we transfer you to London.
But I know that Kiri-Kiri's body was in the back, perhaps sliding back and forth on the long and bumpy road to Johannesburg, where Williams arrived without incident.
Within 10 days of receiving that first telegram, her body was in the possession of the Department of Anatomy. at Wits University.
Kiri-Kiri wasn't buried. There was no closure for her family. Instead, a cast was made of her body and put on display in the Department of Anatomy, where it stood for 6 decades. And for many years, Kiri-Kiri's family had no idea. Here's Nashada Ndango.
He did not really respect the people's feelings, the parents and the family members' feelings, because if you lose someone and then you don't bury them or you don't know where they are, it's going to haunt people forever. It's going to haunt them in their dreams. It's going to haunt them in their daily lives.
Kiri-Kiri's body became part of Raymond Dart's collection of human remains. A collection that was by no means unique. In South Africa and around the world, institutions like museums and universities still hold massive collections of human remains of indigenous peoples. The difference between these thousands of skeletons and Kiri-Kiri is that now we know part of her story.
I don't know what to say when it comes to waiting on somebody's dead body so that you can have that person's bone is it's sick.
And I say part because what eventually happened to a skeleton is still unknown. Here's Krista again.
At some point in the late 1980s or early 1990s, the department lost track of her skeleton, and it's not clear if it was stolen or misplaced.
To me, there's no question as to whether what Raymond Dart did to Kiri-Kiri was wrong. But Dart was no different than his peers. His methods were not considered problematic at the time. Here's Rebecca Ackerman.
At the time when Raymond Dart and his contemporaries were doing their work into understanding human evolution, there were kind of two things going on. One is you had researchers who were out there looking for fossils or having fossils brought to them, as the case may be, to try to understand the fossil record of human origins. And on the other hand, you had people involved in race science, and they were specifically studying living people as models for primitive ancestors. And it seems like those things shouldn't go together, but they were literally looking at people as if they were less evolved.
The scientists at the time had both race and evolution wrong. They thought that some people were less evolved and therefore more prehistoric than others. But this, as you'll know by now, is not true.
It seems crazy nowadays because we know that all people on the planet today have evolved for an equally long period of time from a common ancestor. But at the time, the thinking was that that was potentially not the case.
In the following decades, the ideas forming this way of thinking broke down gradually as more evidence emerged. And soon, the entire idea of biological race began coming apart at the seams. Here's Lauren Schroeder.
A couple of decades, or a decade after World War II, I would say, was that the differences between races started to be seen as not being something that you can ever find. and so people that were studying these sort of differences and were embedded within the sort of racial typological thinking slowly started to be sidelined, I would say. It took a long time. There are still people that write about racial differences.
Let's talk about the buttons. Why do you have a large box with thousands of buttons on the table here? I ended the last episode by asking Rebecca Ackerman about evolution, about a new metaphor instead of the outdated idea of the missing link. And she gave me the image of a braided stream. But she's got one more metaphor. In a cardboard box on the table between us, this one is about race.
Buttons not to push, but ones for clothes, to close your jacket.
For clothing, buttons of all sorts of different sizes and shapes and everything else. And I like to use the button example to get people to think about race and human variation. So things like skin color variation or hair variation or eye color variation or face variation, all that sort of stuff is real, right?
People look different.
Yeah, people look different from each other. We know that. But we also say, because we know this, that there are no biological races. And so what do we mean by that? How can you have the things that we associate with race be real biologically, but races not be real biologically?
I think this is where we often get confused. Because how can we go out into the world and look at people and most of the time easily identify their race if race isn't real?
And so I like to use the buttons, because if I were to give you these buttons and ask you to sort the buttons, however you wanted to sort the buttons.
Right,
yeah,
so there's I'd go probably by size or color.
Okay, so let's say you just choose size and color, and then you were to make a pile of very big buttons and maybe medium-sized buttons and small buttons, and you further separated those so that the big buttons were light buttons and dark buttons, and the medium ones were light and dark, right? And so you have 6 different groups. So you've basically taken this real variation, what we talk about as continuous variation, and you've put it into categories.
The point is that while I chose size and color, I could have chosen something else, like the number of holes in each button or their shapes. And while the difference between the buttons is real, the categories were entirely my choice.
And I might give those buttons to somebody else and they may choose different traits, and they may come up with 10 different categories or 2 different categories or whatever it is. Human variation and race is very similar in the sense that we have this variation, so color, for example, variation, and it goes from very light to very dark. And the world tells us to put things into categories, that there are X amount of races. And we can do it, right? We can draw boundaries within that and make those categories. And similarly with facial variation or hair variation or any of that. But we have to realize that what we have is these overlapping kinds of variation, and that those categories are something that we choose to do. And again, while the variation is real, the categories are choices that we're imposing on that variation.
This is where Raymond Dart and all his contemporaries had it wrong. And frankly, a lot of us still don't quite get it. They mistook the categories they invented for facts. And they believed that measuring people's bones and skulls could tell them where they belonged in an evolutionary and racial hierarchy. But also that measurements could reveal all kinds of things about a person, their abilities and intelligence, for example. And the biggest problem with this was that their work did not only describe the world as they saw it, it helped create it. Not least in South Africa, where race laws were becoming firmer and more restrictive every year. The categories people were put into defined how and where they could live, who they were allowed to love, and even what they could drink. And scientists like Raymond Dart played a very active role in defining all of this.
There were a couple of newspaper articles that I found in the Dart papers that were from 1929. And one was in the Rand Daily Mail, where Dart had examined a woman, Mrs. Neff.
In the archives, historian Krista Kuljan came across a curious story about a woman by the name of Mrs. Neff. She had purchased alcohol in a shop. In and of itself, this should not have been a question for the court, except for one issue: the Liquor Act of 1928. According to this law, non-Europeans were not allowed to possess so-called European liquor, like wine, beer, and spirits, none of which were invented in Europe, by the way. But Mrs. Neff had bought liquor. That much was not disputed. Her race, on the other hand, was. Sir Raymond Dart was called in as an expert witness
and declared that she was not white and that she had, quote, colored blood in her veins. And, at that time, the term colored was used to describe people of mixed ancestry and was later used as an apartheid racial classification.
Just take a moment to picture this. You've done something completely ordinary, like buying a bottle of wine. Now you find yourself in court. A professor you don't know testifies as to what blood you may or may not have in your veins, something that he has no real way of knowing. Because this, your race, is what determines what you can and cannot do. But because race isn't biological or fixed, the situation is absurd. Like if a traffic officer pulled you over and looked at the color of your hair to determine if you'd been speeding or not. But this was the law.
And so that resulted in her being charged with illegal possession of alcohol.
Krista found evidence that Dart had testified in at least one more similar court case.
So Dart clearly, felt comfortable proclaiming in court on someone's racial classification, racial identity, racial type.
Besides the obvious discrimination of allowing one race to buy booze and not another, this shows how race science could directly impact people's lives, and how scientists like Raymond Dart were willing participants in this kind of discrimination. The point of this episode is not to determine whether Raymond Dart was a good or a bad man, or whether science is good or bad either. Like Lauren Schroeder, a scientist herself, says, the point is that we have to understand that perspective matters. That the way scientists choose to sort the buttons is not necessarily the only way they can be sorted.
Yeah, I think science is intertwined with the society that it is being done within. There's no such thing as objective science because people are doing the science and people are people.
Both science and society has come a long way since Raymond Dart described the Taung Child and measured people's skulls and bones. And in a way, this series proves that point. Most of the people we've interviewed and whose work this story is based on are women from diverse backgrounds across the world. 100 years ago, their perspectives were almost entirely missing. Being an archaeologist or a paleoanthropologist was a job for white men. And that's likely one of the reasons why there was so much Dart and the others couldn't see. But we haven't arrived yet. Racism and sexism continues to shape the world and limit people's lives. And some perspectives are still missing. Take the aspiring archaeologist Nashada Ndango, for example, whose own work is limited by how her community experienced science in the past.
I'm going to talk about me now and my community, where I wanted to write a book about my people, especially the queer people, the queer speaking people. I wanted to document how they used to live as hunter-gatherers and how things changed in when this pastoralist lifestyle came in, when this agricultural life came in. But then, because that I'm working outside the community, people sort of think that I am working with researchers and I'm asking them questions so that these researchers can use this for money.
Nashada has to fight on two fronts: for her own place in the scientific community and to convince her own community that she's going to treat them differently than the scientists in the past did. And here is a direct link to Raymond Dart.
I can't tell or I can't write stories of my own people because somebody came before me and messed up. Now I have to come after that and then try to clean it up in a way I can't really clean this up. I can't do what I want to do because somebody felt that if I do research in this way, it's fine. Now I want to do it in the right way. These people think that it's wrong. So much trust is gone and we don't want it to repeat again.
It's of course completely unfair that Nashada suffers from what people like Raymond Dart did. But the skepticism of the community makes a lot of sense. And the story of Kiri-Kiri and her community shows us exactly why that is. Because the story doesn't end with her stolen remains in Johannesburg. After all the people were examined in the Kalahari in 1936, the group of San were taken to Johannesburg. Here, they were part of the so-called Empire exhibition. Not as an audience, but as exhibits. They wore animal skins and had to perform their culture by dancing, singing, and pretending to hunt. They were, in essence, entertainment for an almost entirely white audience who saw them as relics of the Stone Age. Fixed as if they were insects in a display case.
I've heard stories about the performance where people were dancing. I've heard oral stories of people telling that while these performances were happening, the weak ones, like the elderly and the children that was involved in these performances, some of them were really dehydrated and stuff, and then almost fainted and things. So yeah, that's what I've heard from people.
And after having been gazed upon for entertainment, first in Johannesburg and then in Cape Town, they returned to their home in the Kalahari. Here's Krista Kuljan.
So when Clarice and Kanako and their family returned to the Kalahari, they had been evicted from the land that they were living on.
While they were gone, their land had been declared a national park, and they were not allowed to return.
And so for close to 50 years under apartheid, they were dispersed and their community was destroyed.
This is the story that's hidden in the shadows, beyond the spotlight shining on Raymond Dart, 100 years after the discovery of the Taung Child. But 100 years is actually nothing. Not even a blink of an eye on the timescale of paleoanthropology. And that's the good news. History isn't static. Here's Lauren Schroeder.
I think the story that I would want a young person to have access to as a paleoanthropologist, let's say the story of the Taung Child, is the full story.
The stories we tell about ourselves evolve like we do.
So not just the 1925 publication by Raymond Dart, but also the anonymous mine worker and the context in which he was working, the story of the community of Taung and how it was built, the story of the history of South Africa and how certain people were left out, or their voices were completely left out of any kind of scientific study, and why that's the case.
But the full story isn't just one of dispossession. It's also a story of discovery, of excitement, and connection with an ancient relative of all of us.
And then, of course, the scientific story of this awesome, cool fossil ancestor of ours and having the story be in Africa.
In the next episode of the Unburied podcast, we try to take the next step. Along with all the scientists, we'll look at what this kind of storytelling looks like in practice and how science can impact the lives of individuals and communities for the better.
And during one of the lectures in paleontology, I got introduced to these fossil finds in South Africa. And then I remember getting for the first time the scientific information about the Taung Child, the relevance, the contribution it made to the story of evolution in Africa as we know it. And that is when I decided to change the course of my academic career, and we are here today. Yeah.
You've been listening to episode 3 of the Unburied podcast by ARC and the Human Evolution Research Institute at the University of Cape Town. This episode is written, sound designed, edited and mixed by myself and Neil Liddell, based on original research from the special issue of the South African Journal of Science. The Taung Child Then and Now, commemorating its centenary in a post-colonial age. Remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. And as always, if you like what you hear, please share it with someone you like.